This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
Good morning. It's 3 minutes after 10. I hope you had a splendid weekend. I made a terrible mistake last week. Can you work out what it is? Well, it was more of an omission. It was a mistake by omission rather than commission. I have completely neglected to wish the very, very best of luck to everybody doing exams at the moment. Everybody, particularly in the business of doing public exams, the GCSEs and the A-levels. I know what an extraordinary amount of pressure it can put on a household. It can put on the young people and indeed in some cases their parents. And I should have made a point of letting you know that you were in my thoughts. Well, my thoughts and my family, right in the midst of it. We've got the double bubble this year. We've got the GCSEs and the A-levels unfolding in the same house. So, I just sort of thought, good luck, guys. You've got this. Just get through it. It's not the end of the world if it goes badly. And try not to focus too much upon the stresses and the potential consequences of it all, and just get through the moment. Anyway, I'm glad we've cleared that up. 5 minutes after 10 is the time. I've had a thought. It's always a bit dangerous. Just the one. It's a bit dangerous. I've had a thought, and I don't know that I've had this thought before. I must have had this thought before. Is there an original thought under the sun? I don't know that there is. It's certainly in the business of presenting radio programmes. Every time you think you've had an original thought, you find out that Clive Bull and or Nick Abbott did it 20 years ago. But I've had a thought, and it's prompted by this front page. UK sick note culture is fuelled by obesity crisis. And my thought is this. It's a thought about impulses. So I read a headline like that, and I feel an impulse activate within me. Now, some people see a headline like that, and I don't know whether or not I'm doing the Times newspaper a disservice this morning, but certainly we all know that there are headlines that are very deliberately designed to trigger a very specific kind of impulse. We are currently, I think we can all agree, being primed by the government and by their friends in the media to start looking more askance at poorly people. We are being encouraged to be more sceptical about their conditions, to be less generous regarding their inability to work or their difficulties in working. We are clearly, as a nation, being groomed to disbelieve people in receipt of personal independence payments or sickness benefits, just as we have always been groomed to disbelieve people who are unemployed or in receipt of universal credit. And of course, the most obvious one of all is the grooming to believe that everybody coming here from a foreign country wishes us harm, whether they're coming via jumbo jet on one of those safe routes that used to exist, or whether they're coming imperiling their own lives coming across the channel. So that is the impulse. And some of us feel or experience what might be called, in fact, I think it probably should be called, the Lineker impulse, which is to feel protective and to feel kindly, even perhaps sometimes a little paternalistic towards the people being targeted. And I very much suffer from the Lineker impulse. So I read that headline, and my gut reaction is to open the programme attacking the government and attacking the Times for attacking obese people. But here's the thought that I had, literally on the way downstairs to the studio. Is there a case sometimes for both impulses being unhelpful in the context of a complicated and clear problem? So I respond by saying, can we just give obese people a break? And your Auntie Doris's Facebook page is full of people saying they're all lazy, work-shy layabouts who, don't deserve any support from the state at all, eat less, exercise more, all that kind of rhetoric. The people reaching for that impulse, or the people indulging that impulse, or the people having no control over the fact that that's precisely the impulse that is triggered in response to this sort of story, create two poles which then dominate the discourse to the exclusion of the actual story. Do you see what I mean? So I'd rather suffer from the Lineker impulse than the Farage impulse, the impulse to just hate everybody and to push my own inadequacies and problems onto the shoulders of people more vulnerable than me. Clearly, it's a healthier place to be. But is it actually a more helpful place to be? So here are some statistics. Obese people are twice as likely to take time off work. I don't buy into the so-called sick note culture that the government is now furiously peddling with the help of its friends in the media. I think that we have a lot of sickness around. I mean, the contrast between a sickness culture, if you like, or a sick note culture, or the contrast between a sickness epidemic, and let's call it an epidemic of illness. There is an epidemic of illness in the country at the moment, if you follow the facts. But if you follow the feelings being carefully engineered by the government and their friends in the media, there is a sick note culture sweeping the country. Wow. Let's just pause for a moment, shall we, to look at that. Those are two completely contrasting depictions of the same evidence. There is an epidemic of illness sweeping the country, caused by a combination of lifestyle factors, the deliberate denigration of the NHS, possibly on a mental health side of things, the increasingly difficult business of merely staying afloat, 14 years of Tory rule, austerity, Brexit, the promotion of epic incompetence. Do not let me go home today, this is a hook and tease, without providing the latest evidence of James Cleverly being the most inappropriately named politician in the history of the world. So all manner of reasons, our diets, our difficulties in accessing exercise or healthcare support, all manner of reasons why there would be an epidemic of illness in this country at the moment. But the people largely responsible for it, i.e. the Tories and their friends in the media, they prefer to describe it as sick note culture, as if the real problem here is people swinging the lead, people taking the Michael, people telling pork pies when it comes to their own health and their own inability to work. So where do we plot this then? Already, Zozio says, can you please use the phrase people living with obesity? It's less stigmatizing. And that phrase there, stigmatizing, is very true, isn't it? It is, I think, perhaps the most stigmatized section of society, even by people who claim that we should look after our own first. It doesn't seem to extend to anyone. It certainly doesn't extend to the homeless or the poorly, but to the obese, not a chance. But if you are living with obesity, and I don't think I'll be able to keep that up yet, I'll try, Zosha, but if you are living with obesity, you're twice as likely to take time off work. It's not unique to the United Kingdom. Millions of workers across Europe take more sick days the heavier they are, for fairly obvious reasons. Joint pain, diabetes, depression, heart disease. Severely obese adults are 2.5 times more likely to have had at least 1 week off with poor health in the past year, compared with those of a healthy weight. And it struck me that we never ask ourselves why we're not obese. Why are you not obese? Why are you not living with obesity? Why are you not living with obesity? What is it that you do that has protected you from this condition? Some of the explanations will be genetic, but most of them will be behavioural. And that impulse kicks in, I guess, most violently when someone comes along with a simple solution to a complicated problem. You could eat less and exercise more. You'd be absolutely fine. So I'm going to ask you a slightly strange question this morning that I've never asked you before. And I'm not going to confine any contributors. You can come at it with whatever your personal experience is. I suppose if you have lived with obesity but no longer do, you may be best qualified to answer this question. But it's something that I have been on a big, big journey with regard to, without ever having actually asked you this question. What is the best way to talk about people with obesity? 0345 6060 973. Because I don't think anyone can argue that this isn't a problem. The financial impact is estimated to be, of sick leave in total, is estimated to be £33 billion a year. It has doubled in the past decade, and that is an epidemic of illness. It is not a sick note culture. Sick note culture to me conveys the idea that people are getting a sick note regardless of whether they're sick or not. That's why I hate that phrase. I reject that phrase. It's a phrase that Rishi Sunak is keen to introduce to the public discourse, claiming that benefits are becoming a lifestyle choice. Mate, where have you been? Your lot have been claiming that benefits are a lifestyle choice for as long as I've been sentient. But we don't ever stop to wonder, what is the best way to talk about people with obesity? And I'm going to I'm going to encourage you to address something that we've definitely not addressed before. All right? And are attitudes like mine unhelpful? So I've done a full 180 on this. I don't know how long you've been listening to the programme. If you're a relatively recent arrival, I think you'd be quite surprised to discover just how vile I used to be towards people with obesity. It's a source of shame for me. That's not a word I use lightly. It's a source of genuine shame for me, because even as I used to do it, I knew that it was wrong on some subconscious level. I knew that it was hurtful and unkind, but I would do it almost with relish, and I'd almost relish the howls of outrage and the squeals of complaint as proof that I was on some sort of, I don't know, performatively cruel crusade, and I used to be vile. Now that doesn't help at all. There's no earthly way that calling people with obesity rude names, or shouting at them that they should just eat less and exercise more, or laughing at them, or pointing at them and making unpleasant. There's absolutely no way that helps. You might have the occasional Damascene moment, like when something happens involving your child, and you think, right, I do not want to be the obese dad anymore, or the obese mum anymore, and it may have a profound impact, but those are going to be hen's teeth moments. Those are going to be rare. Generally speaking, being rude to people who are suffering won't help them. But I'm not sure who's best placed to answer this question. Is it possible that the opposite attitude doesn't help much either? Is it possible that the sort of live and let live, be kind approach to obesity doesn't help either? Is it possible that the impulse I feel when I read that story, which is to protect people from the incoming attacks from right-wing columnists and right-wing politicians, is it possible that that impulse isn't very helpful either? It's perhaps a bit patronising. It's a bit paternalistic. It's a bit... that phrase, it's not virtue signalling, because it's a sincere impulse. I'm not pretending to care about these people, but is my care manifesting itself in the wrong way? So you've got the Farage impulse, which is to be vile, and then you've got the Lineker impulse, which is to be kind. But which one of those actually helps people living with obesity become less likely to take twice as much time off work, or to be twice as likely to take time off work as someone who is not obese? What is the best way to talk about this? 0345 6060 973. And is it actually possible that people like me have unintentionally been unhelpful, just as unhelpful being nice as I was when I was very nasty? 18 minutes after 10 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The number you need is 0345 6060 973. I can't wait to hear what you've got to say about this one, actually, because I've never thought of it that way before, that the Lineker impulse could be ultimately as unhelpful as the Farage impulse. I'd always choose nice over nasty, but what we should really be choosing ahead of nice and nasty is effective.
James O'Brien on LBC.
21 minutes after 10 is the time. Just to add a little bit of context to those introductory comments, I read a couple of texts to give you an idea of how diverse opinion can be in this space. Karen writes, I work as a mental health nurse. Obesity is very much a mental health issue, as overeating is often a coping mechanism for anxiety, for managing emotions, stress, and soothing the self in a society that is fast changing and scary. It needs to be a joint physical and mental health issue. This is nice from Jamie. Compassion is what's needed when talking about weight. As an obese guy with anxiety and depression, I became overweight from eating my feelings, and then I felt worse, so I ate more. I'm lucky that although I'm heavy, it hasn't impacted my lifestyle unduly, and I still play rugby and go on runs despite yo-yoing between 19 stone and 15 stone, although I've never had a week off work from illness. And Mark in Harrow puts it very well. He says, I know this has to be reported and that it probably comes from a good place, but every time this subject is mentioned, we obese people feel ashamed. Comments like lose weight simply by exercise and diet are as helpful to us as the instruction to a depressive or an alcoholic to just cheer up or stop drinking, respectively. We are addicts, and it's a mental health problem. And then, I suppose, in the other camp, Neil's been in touch. He says, James, it's absolutely pathetic that you're dancing around the apparent difference between calling someone obese and living with obesity. Utterly absurd. It's quite angry for a Monday morning, Neil, about quite an odd thing to get angry about, but all human life is here. He goes on, at what point do we decide that people who are obese need to take some responsibility and accountability for their health and weight? And then finally, Stephen, James, I'm 44. Both my knees deteriorated really quickly, and I'm now stage 4 osteoarthritis. I can barely walk. I've piled on weight, and I now am not working. I work very, very hard in the construction industry since leaving school. I'm constantly fed up. I'd swap anything to go back to work, from being sporty and active to being a near prisoner in my own home. I am not swinging the lead, and yes, I am now fat. So I guess Neil meet Stephen. 23 after 10. Sam's in Woodford. Sam, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
I've got two things to say. So one, I think we need to stop talking about people and start talking with people, like your text messages have just read out, because often people with challenges such as obesity, they know they're obese. Why do we other them? That's the first thing. The second thing, I think we need to take it back to looking at the food industry and actually looking at our produce and the fact that food has become a capitalist construct. And actually the quality of produce that's out there that we're consuming fuels obesity. And actually the austerity, and we're not basically meeting Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so then it makes it more challenging. The third thing is, 2.3 points now.
That's not an opinion, that's counting. Carry on.
Yes. The third thing I'd say is, if we look, it's not helpful to tell people who are already stressed to then eat less and exercise more, because all it does is it increases your stress hormone cortisol, which compounds your insulin resistance, which then makes it harder to lose weight. And it's not about eating less, it's about what we're eating. And if you look at Weight Watchers and all of these, they do commendable things, but actually it's all a capitalist construct.
The profiteering side of food, the way that it's used as a, really just a machine to generate profits. In fact, I don't know if you were listening on Friday when we looked at why this country has extraordinary poor levels of mental health among self-reporting as a 71-country survey of it, and we came bottom on one measure and second bottom to Uzbekistan on the other. And a lad rang in who's a lorry driver, spends most of his time in the Benelux countries, and he went straight for diet on the mental health issue. He went straight for fresh food. Even at a motorway service station as a long-distance lorry driver, he'll pull up in France, and the array of food that's on offer was completely different to what was on offer here. So that's not chicken and egg, is it? That's wrong end of the telescope territory. It's all very well the government making statements about it or the newspapers getting cross about it. In fact, the solution lies in the source, not in the response to the already existing problem. And
the affordability of it. Because actually, I've just been to Sainsbury's this morning, and what did the shop come up to when I bought all my fruit and veg?
Yeah.
and I think because then it's not accessible, it's not affordable, and then if you look at the farming, because the poor farmers they're on this mass cycle.
A nightmare at the moment.
Yeah.
In fact, I owe the British farming community an apology. Would you mind if I interrupted this programme to make it? I am wrong. Repeatedly, I have been wrong to misrepresent the British farming community as being heavily in favour of Brexit. I think we were misled by those bloody signs in fields everywhere, and indeed by the sort of staid hand of the NFU. But they were no more likely to vote for Brexit than any other section of society, give or take a point or two. So I just want to get that on the record and apologise for that. But the problem I've got now, I think you're a GP, aren't you, Sam?
Yes, I am.
So the problem I've got now is your first point had me nodding sagely. We should be talking with and to these people, not talking about them. How do you report the fact that obese people are up to twice as likely to take time off work, which is a significant statistic, without talking about them?
And I think there's something, when you look at commissioning and everything, you've got to bring the voice of lived experience in. And you've got to put it on the wider scale. So actually, yes, they're more likely to take time off work, but so is someone with a drinking problem, so someone who smokes and is really thin. Yeah. So health issues are there. And I think it's just it's another rhetoric that the government want to use. A while back,
lazy othering.
That's it. And a while back, you said something. Why do we always punch down and never look up?
Yes.
Why do we never look up? And that really resonated with me, because most people have better things to do than come to their GPs or sit at a hospital waiting for an appointment. People do not want to be ill, contrary to popular belief. And when I have people come into my room, yes, they want to work. It's just so hard.
That's why this phrase sick note culture is so toxic, isn't it? Because it creates the idea that they're, I'm sure we're back to I don't mean you territory, aren't we? Oh, I don't mean you. I know you're really poorly, but there's loads of them. I read it in the Daily Mail. There's loads of them that are faking it all. And then
you're going to get that proportion in any.
Well, of course you are, and you don't. If you start legislating everything to deal with the tiny minority of people who are taking the proverbial, then everybody suffers. Sam, I'm going to crack on because I want to squeeze in one more call before the news. But that was really helpful. 3 points there, albeit that she promised 2. David is in Huddersfield. David, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I mean, I've been obese all my life, really, and had very little help with that. I can remember being like 11 stone when I was 7-year-old, and the doctor suggested that I should have my mouth wired up.
As a joke?
So that I couldn't... No, not as a joke. I was totally serious. He was a very serious person. I mean, I'm nearly 70 years old, so I'm talking a lot of years ago, but, for years and years and years, I've been spoken down to, like bullied. Yes. Because of it. And I think people, sort of should talk to people as a person, not as an object, and, try and understand what's happening in their lives. I mean, I was at the heaviest, I was 34 stone. I've lost 10 stone since 2016 with a lot of changes and a personal coach. But there was nothing back in the day, so it was really, really difficult. I have serious health conditions because of the obesity, but it's like being discriminated against. It's like any form of discrimination.
So let me read you what Neil said. Is that at what point do we decide that people who are obese need to take some responsibility and accountability for their health and weight? So we need to be more... I mean, you can't get much more robust than telling a kid that he's going to have his jaw wired up. How do you make someone like Neil understand that they've been led into a position of quite dangerous ignorance with regard to people like you? And how do I know for sure that feeling protective towards you isn't actually unhelpful because it encourages you, or it doesn't encourage you to make any sort of changes to your life?
Well, I think if I'd have been listened to when I was younger, instead of being talked at, and when I say talked at, almost like Gestapo type talk from doctors, I was told that I would never get to 50 years old That wasn't achievable. I think if somebody had just sat down with me and listened properly, to what was happening, then I could have received help a lot earlier. But I think everything's geared towards you just need to do this.
Yeah,
like you said yourself.
No,
eat
and
less,
we're part of that problem.
more.
Then that's why I'm so glad you've got on early today, because otherwise it does become a conversation about you rather than with you. And some of the stuff you said is of sort of startling clarity and simplicity. Just talk to us about what's going on more. David's made enormous changes as a consequence of having a personal coach, not as a consequence of having someone shouting at him from the pages of the Daily Mail. Still room, though, of course, to explore the idea that the impulse to be kind doesn't necessarily equate to being helpful. 10:31 is the time. Thomas Watts has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:35 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Do you know where the phrase "follow the money" comes from? Or at least when it became popularised. I didn't say "show me the money." That's a different catchphrase. That's Jerry Maguire, isn't it? Show me the money. That's Cuba Gooding Jr.'s "Show me the money, Jerry! Jerry, show me the money!" But where did "follow" that? It also comes from Hollywood, actually. It comes from the All the President's Men film, which was the dramatisation of the Watergate scandal, or certainly of the Washington Post, the investigations by Woodward and Bernstein into Richard Nixon's Watergate scandal. Follow the money. If you want to work out why something has happened, you follow the money. You can get to the bottom of corruption, or by looking at the money transfers between parties. But I'd always taken it a little further. If you want to understand why something apparently awful is happening on a grand scale, follow the money. And the money leads to precisely who our first caller identified. The company's making huge amounts of cash out of selling hugely unhealthy food. And this is a really British stroke American peculiarity. It doesn't happen in other countries. I've often told you about a Greek friend of mine, the father of my friend, who came to London for the first time and got a fit of the giggles in a supermarket because he couldn't believe the sort of homogeneous, uniform state of our vegetables, the fact that all our tomatoes were perfectly spherical and had no blemishes on there. It's just sort of not... I mean, that's the healthy food, which has been homogenized, if you like. So the money, where does follow the money? And then when you look at the work people like Jamie Oliver have done to try to improve the quality of our food, why does he come under attack? And who does he come under attack from? He comes under attack from the right-wing media, from the so-called think tanks, the lobby groups masquerading as so-called think tanks who are furious about ideas like putting taxes on fizzy drinks or trying to reduce access to sweets or anything that might dent the profits of the secret donors that fund these outfits that pop up on your TVs and radios with unerring regularity, and often the Tory parties, politicians who, as with the betting industry, will often be found to be in receipt of donations from precisely the architects of the problem that is blighting the nation. It's mad when you actually get a full picture of how circular it all is. And then you have ultra-processed food, currently the best-selling non-fiction paperback in the country. Yeah, great. Well done. Great, yeah. Ismail's in Cardiff. Ismail, what would you like to say?
Hello, hi James.
Hello.
I'm first time caller here.
Welcome.
Thank you. Right, I'm a NHS psychiatrist, and
Okay.
I deal with obesity as part of my daily work.
Okay.
I find what is written in the papers is highly unethical, highly uninformed,
Yeah.
and it's completely unhelpful, because obesity is a multifactorial issue. It's a symptom rather than an illness, and it will tell you a lot about the well-being of the patient, both mentally, physically, and socially. So for us to, for the paper to just point a finger and to label these people who are living with the plight of obesity, that I'm sure nobody would like to be obese or to feel sidelined.
There's two things going on there, isn't there? It's you will occasionally find somebody, sometimes in this line of work, who will use their own obesity as a stick with which to beat other people by saying, look, I know I'm fat, it's my fault, and I take full responsibility for it, and therefore everybody else who's fat is obviously made some sort of lifestyle choice at some point to live that way, and if it's costing the NHS lots and lots of money, then they should be robustly encouraged to change their ways or to change their lifestyle. It buys into the idea that people have done it either through free choice or willfulness. And that, of course, takes away the state's responsibility to pay people like you to help.
Well, the state is fully responsible for these for people with obesity, because it's not providing them with the proper proper type of nutrition that they need, the type of support that they need, and the type of health service that they need. So obesity is it's a symptom of an unwell body, basically. So we really need to work on mentally providing them with the support they need for them to be able to feel confident and to go out and to achieve what they needed to achieve, and to look at it as a symptom. So if somebody is depressed and he is on medication, and I have to say that 70% or more of our medication cause obesity.
Right. So you mean antidepressants?
Antidepressants, antipsychotics, any kind of, if it works, there is a saying, if it works in your mind, it will make you put on weight.
Yes, I understand that, and I haven't got the statistics in front of me, but I've got no reason to doubt you. So, I mean, the problem here that I hear from you then is the scale of the mountain to climb, and the last thing that is going to help is increased demonisation or pretending that there are simple solutions to complicated problems, or Rishi Sunak marching around the country talking about a sick note culture becoming a lifestyle choice.
He just got it the other way around. So basically, it's not because they are lazy, because they're obese. Because it's the obesity is the obesity is a symptom of an underlying problem. In fact,
Ismail, mate. I'm just sorry. I just had a real penny drop moment. Were you listening on Friday, or were you busy looking after your patients?
Well, to be honest, Friday is the busiest day of the week.
Yeah, all right. Well, I'll let you off then. I'll let you off for not tuning in, although you can. There is a podcast. So on Friday, we had a conversation about why the United Kingdom was performing so abominably on international comparison charts for mental well-being. This is the same phone-in.
Absolutely, it's just I think the state is trying to wash its hand from looking after of people and living with the plight of obesity, and I'm sure that it's not a choice that somebody will choose to be obese. It's just they're being let down by the system and by people who are supposed to look after them.
And thank God we've got people like you looking after them, Ismail, and more power to your elbow. But it's I wonder did anyone get there before me? Anyone who was listening on Friday who's realised this is exactly the same phone-in. I touched on it when I talked about the lorry driver stopping off for fresh food. I had another one in charge. I drive 40,000 miles a year, says Adam. I regularly have to stop for food when I forget to prep in advance, and you would be hard pushed to find a piece of fruit that's not cut up in a plastic pot on sale for £4.50 in a service station anywhere in this country. The ones with the supermarkets in them have got some, but as he says, they're often cut up in a plastic pot and they're charging £4.50. If you're stopping at the petrol bit and nowhere else, I know this as a parent, you will not find fresh fruit. Don't text me to find you once bought an orange at the Heston services. This isn't a complete 100% statement. But Gillian, while Ismail was talking, writes, obese all my life, gastric band 20 years ago, gastric bypass 10 years ago, still obese. Made some mental health changes 1 year ago. I've now lost 4 stone and I'm off my antidepressants. Life is slowly improving. Focus on the tiny changes. Compassion and encouragement work. This is the same phone-in as the one about mental well-being. If we wanted to do it now, why does this country have a particular problem with this issue? The answers would be almost identical to the answers that came in on Friday when we asked why is the United Kingdom performing so poorly on these general well-being, mental well-being, international comparisons. I'm sorry if you spotted this ages ago and you don't think that it's significant at all, but I've got that weird feeling I get sometimes when I'm talking to you. I go, oh, blimey. It's like looking at a magic eye. Do you remember those magic eye things in the 80s? Where you'd stare at squiggly lines for ages and suddenly you'd see a train. I could never see the train. I gave up on them after a while. They were like everywhere for a while. You remember? There's like these, you'd stare and think, oh my lordy, there's a train. I never saw the train. I feel like I just saw the train. Do you feel like you just saw the train? I feel we just saw the train. It's the same phoneme. Hayley's in Antrim. Hayley, what would you like to say?
I saw the train a long time ago.
Choo-choo!
Bear with me, okay? Just
a
few wee things. I have a condition called lipedema. Now,
Right.
lipedema, it causes significant disproportion to hip-waist ratio. So you're slimmer on top, but you're bigger at the bottom.
Okay.
You can be slim and have lipedema,
Right.
but it is unlikely. So this affects 10% of the world's population. It causes, it's an abnormal fatty buildup at the
Right.
hips, buttocks, lower and upper limbs. Doesn't affect your feet, doesn't affect your hands. And you walk in to a doctor's surgery and they see fat.
Right.
It doesn't matter that you can't remove the fat with diet and exercise. You cannot remove this fat with diet and exercise. That is the problem. The only way that it is removed is a specific type of liposuction
Really?
that you have to pay for privately.
So it's not even treated. So the more we pretend that these issues are simple, the more we consign ourselves to never ever fixing or improving the situation for anybody, whether they've got what I might describe as traditional obesity, which is, as every other caller has highlighted, widely misunderstood and much better understood as a mental health condition, whereas lipedema is very much a physical condition. So that would need to be treated in a completely different way, and yet it isn't treated at all.
And it leads then to joint pain and your joints wearing away, and then you can't have knee replacement or hip replacement because you're overweight. But you're overweight because of the fat deposits. So, I mean, there was a nice are happy enough to do it or recommend it, but they'll not do it on the NHS, obviously.
No. So the proper treatments cost money. So another penny.
My last surgery cost me £7,500 to get the top of my bottom slimmed down.
Right.
So I could then lie on my back. And I have another one at £9,000 to get the backs of my legs treated because they catch on everything. I am about 26 stone,
right,
and about 13 stone of that is lipedema. If the government it's Northern Ireland, so you'll not get anything over here. But anyway.
No, well, I'm glad you've done this for two reasons. Number one, for the broader context you provide to the almost borderline absurdity of having generalised conversations about, quotes, obesity, end quotes. And secondly, for drawing attention to your very specific condition, which makes a mockery of the idea that you can do this by shouting at people to improve their lifestyles or being a bit meaner to them, which wouldn't work on anybody, but it's certainly not going to work on people with a mental basis for their obesity or on people with a medical, physical, biological basis for their obesity. And of course, that's the point. That was the penny drop moment I had while Hayley was talking. There's pennies dropping all over the place today. It's going to cost a lot of money. How can the government, dedicated to starving the NHS of funds, dedicated to diluting the level of service provided, dedicated to denigrating doctors and demonising nurses, how can the politicians and their friends in the media who have spent the last 14 years attacking the NHS possibly admit that big problems in need of solutions will be solved by spending more in the short term and saving billions in the long term? But that is not something that this lot seem to care about. And of course they're kept afloat financially by people looking everywhere. Venture capitalists, even in the care home sector, venture capitalists in the nursery sector, everywhere looking for a quick buck as opposed to a sustainably profitable company. So there are positive private sector interventions in these spaces, but not when it is motivated by the deep desire to trouser as much cash as possible as quickly as possible. 10:49 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:52. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Ian is good. Says James cleverly reminder. Shall I do that? I'll do that a bit later, because this has been a really good hour, because the answer to the first question, you haven't addressed it directly, but indirectly we've answered it. So I think it is not necessarily helpful to be impulsively kind. We need to protect these people from the attacks of the government, the attacks of right-wing media. But if you actually think about it and talk with the people at the heart of the story, then you achieve the same effect of defending and rebutting ludicrous right-wing rhetoric, but you do it from a position of evidence rather than emotion. So while you may be lucky enough to have the Lineker impulse to respond to other people's suffering with kindness and empathy, that should start the conversation which leads to evidence and clarity. And the more evidence and clarity you have, the more ridiculous it becomes to have a Prime Minister talking about a sick note culture and benefits becoming a lifestyle choice. Those are both direct quotes. Another point he misses spectacularly, which Emma brings to my attention, is that, of course, disability and illness can be the causes of obesity. Very often. Physical disabilities and illnesses can be the causes of obesity. I think we're getting to a place where most of us, with a few exceptions, understand that mental illness can be, or mental fragility, mental stress, mental health can be a cause of obesity, or often is, in fact. 10:53 is the time. Gareth is in Exeter. Gareth, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello. Yeah, first time caller. Listen regularly.
Thank you. Welcome.
My wife's been telling me to ring every time this subject comes up, and I've eventually built up the courage to. So,
well, thank you both. Thank you her. Thank you to your wife as well.
Yeah, I don't know where to start. I was 22.5 stone in 2009, and I'm now 11 stone. That sort of fluctuated up and down a little bit over that period of time, but now I sort of feel I'm on top of it. I was diabetic, type 2 diabetic,
right,
before I lost the weight, and now I'm classed as being diabetic in remission because they couldn't work out how to say I wasn't diabetic on their system. But my last bloods I had, the doctor sent me a text message saying, "How have you got your cholesterol at such low numbers without being on medication?"
Wow.
So I'm completely off medication. I was on the top of everything I could take for diabetes, and my next step was insulin, and that was sort of the trigger. I think I realised then that this is serious. I've got to do something about it. My experience of people talking to me back then was I would go for my annual reviews, and they'd say, "Oh, you could do with losing a few pounds.
Yes.
What's the portion control?" And I needed to lose more than £2, and it was that being nice to you. And I think everyone, as your previous conversations have had, is that people want to be nice to you, but I don't know if I'm rambling now.
No, you're making perfect sense. Because what you're doing is really drive. There's a world in between being nice and being nasty. It's not. I mean, there's a whole world between those two.
And
points.
I was lucky to meet my wife partner, and she told me what I needed to hear, and has been incredibly supportive.
And what did you need to hear?
You need to lose weight, or you're going to die.
Yeah.
that was.
But that works for you. And I see why.
Me.
But, how many alcoholics have been told that they're going to die if they don't stop drinking, and yet they still can't stop drinking?
And I think if you look at, it's all about the environment. I had to get out of the environment and from the social groups that were fueling my weight.
Oh, that's
and
interesting.
If you're an alcoholic or if you smoke, the best way to make that last is to avoid people who smoke or drink.
Yes, of course.
So, I'm in an environment at home where we eat. We're both vegans. I've been vegan for 8 years.
Gosh.
I'm not saying that's the answer because there's unhealthy vegan food. There's also processed vegan
but you
food.
eat a lot of fresh fruit and vegetables.
We eat fresh food and vegetables. We avoid all ultra-processed food as much as we can. I gave up drinking alcohol 5 years ago as a bet.
Well done. I know, and you hung in there, and all of this helps. It's similar to what I think Tom Watson wrote a book about this, didn't he? Putting type 2 diabetes into remission by just making massive lifestyle changes.
Yeah. And yesterday I rode 125 miles across Bodmin Moor and Dartmoor.
In a sentence, How different is your life now from when you were 22 stone?
Oh, completely different. I was one of those people who would go off sick periodically with sciatica because my body couldn't cope with walking around with that much weight.
I'd say everything changes. And that last point is as powerful as any of the other points you've made. You couldn't cope. Your body couldn't cope with the weight that you were carrying. The sciatica, the problem with linking the phrase obesity crisis to the phrase sick note culture, as both the Prime Minister and the Times newspaper does today, is it creates the idea that there's something fraudulent about the sick days, whereas in fact, sciatica is it's no laughing matter, and B, it's certainly no sort of con at all. Thank you, Gareth. Chris is in Liverpool. Chris, what would you like to say?
Thanks, James. First-time caller, although I've always wanted to come in on the politics rather than this.
Well, this is politics in a way. Everything is, isn't it?
It is, and I guess my point is I think we need to change the narrative. So at the latter end of lockdown, I was about 18 stone. I started doing running because you could obviously do the 1 hour exercise thing, and I was walking and wanted to bring that up, stuff like that. But I've lost about 3 stone since lockdown, I suppose, officially ended.
Yes.
And, that's a combination of doing bits of exercise casually and just eating differently. But the main thing for me is that during this whole kind of lose weight obesity narrative is that there's so much conflicting information. Now, look, I'm not a doctor, but there's so much out there. Like you get the Instagrams and the TikTok influencers that kind of say, well, eat a tomahawk steak and 5 million eggs, and that's all you need in your diet to lose a ton of weight, and that there's nothing else that you can kind of do that will change anything to do that. But then you've got other people kind of saying completely different things, eat your 5 a day and stuff like that, and that's all very good. But people are different people. If I want to have a Kit Kat later today, I'm going to have a Kit Kat later today. And I don't think it's helpful for people that kind of want to make the lifestyle choices to just kind of make that sudden jump to kind of absolutely change everything in your life. That will work for some people, but it's not going to work.
Well, I guess this is the sort of final point of the whole hour, isn't it? Is that we begin the conversation by thinking that there is a solution. UK sick note culture fueled by obesity crisis. Oh, how can we fix that? What's the nicest way to hold this conversation? How do you enter into this? And every person who's part of this issue is going to be different and need a different thing. For some people, being told by your wife that you're going to die if you don't make meaningful changes will be the impetus that you need. For other people, that'll have you reaching for the snack drawer straight away because it's made you feel so awful that the only thing that will make you feel briefly, temporarily, and almost misleadingly better is by eating again.
James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 11. See if you can insert the missing number into this headline. Remember that the confected nonsense about Angela Rayner's old council house involves an alleged capital gains tax bill of about £1,500. Okay, the desperate attempts to pretend that as with Keir Starmer's curry supper, there is some egregious offence here. The Sunday Mirror had an extraordinary investigation yesterday from their investigations editor Nick Summerlad. 4 Tory MPs who made X pounds selling taxpayer-funded second homes won't say if they paid tax. The Tories were accused of hypocrisy after pushing for police to probe Deputy Labour leader Angela Rayner over a £48,000 profit she made selling a former council house. So how much do you think those 4 Tory MPs have made by selling taxpayer-funded second homes while still refusing to reveal whether or not they paid any tax at all on the profits? Have a guess. In pounds, how much do you think? 100,000? 500,000? 4. So let's say £250,000 each. So £1 million, about £1 million, £5.4 million. 4 Tory MPs who made £5.4 million selling taxpayer-funded second homes, which means the taxpayer funded the mortgage on them, won't say whether or not they have paid any tax at all. It's an incredible story, quite an old school story. There will be wriggles and wrinkles in it about eligibility and rules that are different now from what they were when these properties were purchased or when these MPs lived in them. But David Tredinnick, Eleanor Lang, Shailesh Vara and Maria Miller, all failing to respond to Daily Mirror requests as to whether they paid capital gains tax on the second homes that they sold. So next time you hear someone pretending that Angela Rayner's disputed £1,500 capital gain tax bill is a matter of national import or evidence of something other than the desperation of right-wing media to hurt her, and indeed the Tory party, just keep that figure in the back of your head, £5.4 million. And it's interesting because I want to have a conversation with you about people buying their own council houses. I checked the meaning of the word shibboleth this morning. I think it's a really beautiful word. But the reason why I checked the meaning of it is because it's not a word I've used very often. And I actually got the meaning wrong. I asked a younger colleague to help me out on the meaning of shibboleth, and they actually got it wrong as well. I thought a shibboleth, and this might be one of those things that's got two meanings, but I thought a shibboleth was something that everyone just thought was true, right? It's almost like a sacred cow. Did I say holy cow earlier when I meant sacred? I think I said holy cow earlier when I meant sacred cow, didn't I? Oh dear. It's like a sacred cow. It's something that is so widely subscribed to that you're not really allowed to question it. That's not what a shibboleth is. A shibboleth is a kind of custom or a principle that's no longer important. That's not what I don't know why I'm doing an introduction to a conversation about council housing by telling you that I misunderstood the meaning of the word shibboleth this morning, but I felt it was pertinent. I wanted a fancy word to describe an opinion that everybody thinks, or a phenomenon that everybody thinks is a good thing. So I started asking around this morning about right to buy, as it was called, when it was introduced by Margaret Thatcher, and a housing minister called Ian Gow, of whom a little more later. And I presumed that it was a good thing. There's a very good piece about the inner workings of the Labour leadership at the moment, and it's suggested in that piece that one of Keir Starmer's most influential advisors is adamant that you have to keep right to buy in the offer, in the Labour offer, because it speaks to almost an emotional commitment to the idea of helping people help themselves. But the more we talked about it this morning, the more I found myself wondering whether this is actually a good thing. Andy Burnham is very keen to be excused from the requirement to include right to buy properties in the 10,000 new social homes that he wants to build in Manchester. He, of course, was re-elected as Mayor of Manchester a couple of weeks ago. I think Sadiq Khan has said, he did say last year that he wanted to pause the right to buy in London. This idea, sacred cow is what I want, isn't it? Sacred cow. That's what it's a sacred cow, that right to buy is a good thing. People who despise Margaret Thatcher's legacy sometimes leaven their detestation by saying, well, of course, right to buy was a good thing. And there's something very compelling, isn't there, about the idea of somebody living in a council house being able then to become a stakeholder in society, to have capital as opposed to social capital. So while the Tories were stripping away social capital, robbing us of our sort of birthrights and our national treasures like the utility companies or the water companies or British Gas, flogging it all off, and to shareholders, they were also offering an opportunity to some people to replace the loss of their social capital with real capital. But who is qualified to comment today on whether or not it is a general good or a general bad? Answer, almost anybody. I've got a problem here. I've got a class problem. A socio-economic problem here is that for somebody who is a homeowner, well, a mortgagee, and was even in his 20s on the housing ladder, and always presumed that I would be able to do so growing up, I would become a homeowner. I'm a little wary of saying that a scheme designed to allow people who would otherwise never become homeowners to become homeowners is a general bad. But I think it might have been. A couple of things that spring to mind, right? I wonder how much of this you knew. 40% of the homes sold under this policy are now being let on the private market. So they've made their way into the hands of private landlords who are now renting them at higher rates than they would have been rented for had they remained social housing. If you go to Brighton, what do you think the proportion is? The proportion of homes sold under the right to buy policy in Brighton that are now in the hands of private landlords. What do you think the proportion is in Brighton? 86%. 86% of the homes sold under right to buy in Brighton are now in the hands of private landlords. And this story, I need to just get the details of this absolutely right, because I read it in the Daily Mirror about 10 years ago and I couldn't actually believe my eyes. It's the son of the Tory minister who brought in the scheme, the Tory housing minister who brought in the scheme, became a massive multiple owner of former council flats. So the minister was called Ian Gow, and he presided over the right to buy scheme. And his son is, or was in 2013, a buy-to-let landlord who owned scores of former council flats. In fact, in 2013, when the Daily Mirror looked into this, they found that a third of ex-council homes were now owned by wealthy landlords. I don't know whether that figure has gone up or down, but it raises the possibility of the politicians who introduced it. I don't know what conversations were had around the dinner table in that home. It could be a complete coincidence that the son of the housing minister who masterminded the introduction of right-to-buy schemes ended up owning 30-odd council flats that had been bought previously under the right-to-buy scheme. The big problem, of course, is that they weren't replaced. The big problem is that the stock that was sold off was not then replaced with new builds, which means that you are reducing the amount of housing available every time you sell off a right to buy. But the political stroke philosophical stroke emotional heft of this policy remains considerable, doesn't it? The idea that you could become a homeowner despite having had no access to home ownership for generations through your family. So who wants to have a crack at this? Who wants to have a crack at whether the right to buy scheme, as introduced by Margaret Thatcher's government, I think it may have been one of those things that already existed, but they just ramped it up enormously. I don't think so. I think it came in 1980. It did. So it was a huge, what a masterstroke politically for a prime minister who was going to dismantle or sell off much of our public infrastructure to sort of set the tone for 2.5 administrations of selling publicly owned utilities to the private sector. What a masterstroke it was to do a sort of mini version of it that makes the population feel like they're beneficiaries and winners of privatisation. Because in some ways, and you're going to have to forgive me for never having spotted this before, the right to buy scheme is the micro equivalent of privatisation in general. It allows, and of course you get a discount by dint of having lived in the house, which is objectively unfair because that house belonged to everybody in that area and you get it at a knockdown price simply because you were lucky enough to have been allocated it 20 years previously. And then things get even more complicated because what it means now, that the discount that you get, the knockdown you get on the price of the house that becomes eligible for purchase under the right to buy scheme, means that if councils build new houses, this is why Sadiq Khan and Andy Burnham are keen for exemptions from the requirement to have right to buy properties in their new build plans. It literally means that, God, I'd never thought of this before, but it literally means that the council could lose money on a new build. So it builds a house, it's eligible for right to buy, it's bought with a massive discount, and the council has lost money on the house that it's built in the hope of providing social housing for people that need it. There's a lot going on here, but I would cautiously suggest that John Harris, writing in The Guardian today, is absolutely bang on the money when he writes, if we are going to build social housing, we need to stop selling it off. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. I mean, you might be laughing at me, as usual. This might be one of those mornings where you go, oh, well done, James, better late than never. Of course it was bad for the country, but the reason why we spent 50 years thinking it was good, or 40 years thinking it was good, is ... So that's question number one. Was it good or bad for the country, the right to buy scheme? No one can dispute that it was... Oh, my Lord, I've had another penny drop moment. That's conservatism in a nutshell. No one can dispute that it was good for the people who benefited from it directly, but was it bad for everybody else? So about 2 million people, 2 million houses have moved from public ownership to private ownership, which is great for them. But has it been bad for Britain? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It's 11:17.
James O'Brien on LBC.
19 minutes after 11 is the time. I'm totally gobsmacked that you've only just spotted this, James. Right, it's Dan in Newcastle. It was a keystone of Britain's social contract, and it's affected absolutely everything since. I did spot it. I was aware of that story in 2013 that I referred to a moment ago. But as a middle-class man, I think I've been very reluctant to say that offering working-class people a chance to buy a home that would otherwise have been beyond their reach was a bad policy. Does that make sense? Does that make more sense, Dan? It's not that I couldn't see what you could see. It's that I was reluctant to be led to the conclusion that you were led to, certainly publicly. For a middle-class man to say that the right to buy scheme is bad is very, very easily depicted as being snobbish, out of touch, pulling up the drawbridge, divisive, which is why I'm asking you what you think. And we're going to look at the whys of it as much as the whats. James is in Sidcup. James, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
It's a little while since we spoke.
But you are the housing guru of our days, aren't you, if I remember
Guru,
correctly.
steady on now.
Okay.
Just a guy who made a living
yes.
with 30, 35 years. I was right at the coalface when this was brought in as a relatively junior officer.
Right. And
most of us professionals at the time knew it was a disaster.
Really?
Absolutely. Within the same period, councils were not allowed to build council homes, let alone use the receipts from right to buy sales. And if it at the time, James, it was resisted, and
by whom?
I think you've been on a journey, if I may say, for maybe the last 10 years.
Yes, I think so.
But I, to be fair, I don't think you probably fully appreciated how against this policy most, and it would generally be Labour authorities, but many rural local authorities.
But I didn't have this job, so all I'd have been going on was the newspapers and the received wisdom that I was being spoon-fed by the politicians that came up with these ideas, and in most cases, with the exception, I suppose, of the Mirror and the Guardian, the media that supported them. And also, you understand what I mean by middle class. You understand how I've got a discomfort as a middle class man saying a scheme designed to help working class people become property owners when they never otherwise would have done. I feel very uncomfortable condemning that.
No, I perfectly understand, but that
doesn't mean it's right.
Starting point, you see, James.
Yes.
I take the point of Notting Hill when it was an absolute slum in the 30s and 40s, and that was the epitome of private landlord accommodation.
Yes.
The private sector had produced. I took the view that the miracle that took place from the mid-40s through into the 60s and 70s that saw very, very humble families have somewhere warm and decent to live at a rent that meant that their children could save money, perhaps to consider buying their own home. That launch pad should not have been taken away from generation after generation that followed. And it's no coincidence that the right to buy helped to win Thatcher her elections.
Yes.
Because without it, they would have been borderline, or she would have lost. Of course it was popular to those that thought of themselves and thought short term.
Whether they availed themselves of the opportunity or not, the knowledge that they could would make them more amenable to the party that allowed them to.
Absolutely. Now, my recollection is this. For about 6 years, the official line in Labour authorities was to go slow.
Right.
And they did, in fact, go slow on applications. But that was put right by further legislation, penalties against the authority, and strict timescales for making those sales happen.
Wow.
So I'm afraid once it had started, I think after about 6 or 7 years was the first time I heard that a Labour councillor was doing the right to buy themselves.
Wow.
Now, that was heavily frowned on.
Was it?
Heavily, heavily frowned on. And I'm talking about officers, not just...
there was a philosophical divide. Would it have... I'd forgotten that there was a moratorium on building new homes, even as they sold them off. But if they had been building them at the rate they were selling them off, then a lot of the problems you described would have been avoided. Although, depending on what the discount rate was, and I'd never noticed this until today, that would raise the possibility of councils building homes and then being compelled to sell them at a loss. But the big failing is the failure to build, or was it absolutely flawed from the very, very start, James?
No, it's utterly flawed.
Yeah.
Utterly flawed. Trying to replace houses in areas where it's not possible to replace them. There isn't the land.
Yeah, of course.
These are vital pieces of terra firma that will never be refound.
And do you think that if we had sat down with Ian Gow or Margaret Thatcher or I suppose Keith Joseph probably had some fingerprints on this sort of idea in 1980 and said, in 2024, a significant proportion of these homes will be in the hands of private landlords who are not bound by any of the responsibilities that social housing landlords are, they would have known, though. I mean, would that have been the plan, or is that just a side effect?
I have no doubt whatsoever, I'd go further than that,
Go on.
that several members of that government saw great opportunities.
Wow. So give it a few years, and then we'll buy them up.
Mr. Gow and his son, in the end, I think, almost owned a complete block
of former council properties.
Yes, bit by bit.
Go on.
The fact is, it's very simple, James. You have a look at now at the proportion of housing for rent at a rent that people do not feel with secure tenancies, where they do not feel insecure, where children are moved 2, 3, 4 times in a year, and schools changed at the whim and wish of a landlord that is now owning a former council home. The housing benefit bill has more than doubled.
Yeah, of course it has, and that is simply a lot of that will be a magnification caused by the change of ownership. There's one more thing that I think we haven't touched on, which is the sort of realisation a few years, even for those that benefited from it, a few years after buying their own homes, these people would realise that they'd actually limited the chances of their own children having access to housing, let alone ever becoming homeowners.
Absolutely. The short-termism. This is winning the pools. Where on earth were these people ever going to obtain sometimes 2/3 of the value of a property, except this way or winning the pools?
And then of course the votes of the people that won the polls, or indeed thought that they were able to win the polls. And you're right, we often talk about the Falklands War as being an incredible factor in that 83 election, and the SDP were leading in the opinion polls shortly before the ballot. But how many people walked into the ballot box that year with the thought in their mind that they were about to win the polls, that they had won the polls, or that they could win the polls, and it would all be down to Maggie? James, as ever, you live up to your billing as a truly profoundly insightful contributor to any conversation that we have about housing, and you remind me that we probably haven't had enough recently. John's in Chesham. John, what would you like to say?
Right, go back a little bit. I bought mine probably 1982, 1983.
Okay, early
like
doors then. Early doors.
Early doors. I was a storeman in a heavy industry to do with. We did built trucks, military stuff, and we did a lot of work for abroad, Saudis and Africa. So when Thatcher was, I'm not a Thatcher man at all. I'm a union man. So I bought it because it made sense. I thought, well, yeah, that's going to be a good thing, and it'll do my kids good and everything else. Now I bought it thinking, right, that they were going to build new homes, all right, which they didn't. No. And then she sold off all the councils, or most of the councils don't own their own homes now more. They're all privately run companies. So in our area, we live in the countryside. It's awful.
What do you mean it's awful? Why do you say that?
Well, because the council, the companies now that are running the homes don't run them properly. They're not maintenance properly.
Yeah.
You can't. I've got 6 grandchildren ranging from 23 to 6 months.
Right.
There ain't one of them got a chance in hell of buying a home or getting a home. I've got one of my kids is living in a pokey little flat with a 6-month-old and his other half, and they got no chance of getting out, moving. Now, in the 70s, when me and my wife started moving around in it was easy. You could get a council place, no problem at all. You just
so you're the perfect caller in a way. So it changed your life enormously for the better in terms of your financial situation.
It did at the time. I mean, if I was to say how much I bought it for, I mean,
go on.
17 and a half grand. three bedroom, massive great loft that you could build another 2 homes in. The other thing was that the councils turned around to you, they gave you the price and then gave you 18 months. So in them
to hold it, they held the price for 18 months so that you could get the money together.
And back in them days, in the industry I was in, and well, like everybody was back in them days, you used to get a rise every year.
Right, yeah. So you're better off by the time you'd sign on the dotted line than you were when you agreed to buy it in the first place.
Well, yeah. By the time I had the next pay rise, which was, I don't even think it was a year. By the time I got the next pay rise, I was able to buy it.
Easy
so
peasy. We're going to run out of time. So I understand your central point, which is that you benefited from a system in the short term, which in the long term is going to harm all of your children and grandchildren in a way that you would never have countenanced or signed up for had you known then what you know now. But actually listening to you, I'm wondering, did it change your life? You've got capital now. When you finally...
No, I haven't.
Right.
That was because I made a life mistake, and I went into business with someone and got complete. I live in a mobile home now, but that's.
But you could have done. You could have ended up. You could have been the first person in your family to have capital to hand on to your children.
Yes, because the home that I sold, that council home for 120 grand.
Jeez.
Right.
It's a nice bit of business, isn't it?
No, but back to the council.
Right.
Because it wasn't a council then, it was parent.
Fair enough. So you did access a chunk of change, the size of which you would never have had access to. Like James said in Sidcup a minute ago, it was like winning the pools. But what occurred to me, if it hadn't been for that business disaster, was that it's still only worth one home. So as long as you live in a home, that capital is dormant. There's not a great deal you can do with it because it's one home. You need to move somewhere else. You sell it the first time, you move somewhere else. And a lot of people obviously wouldn't have stayed on the ladder either. And the percentage that has moved into the hands of private landlords, as James in Sidcup suggests, may have been the plan all along. 11:32 is the time. Thomas Watts has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Richard writes, I write this from the house I bought off my gran when she had to be looked after. It was bought with the right to buy. The problem was that they didn't build any houses to replace them. That was 22 minutes ago. I think that the sort of traditional get-out clause of saying if they built more it would have been okay doesn't cover as much ground as I previously thought it did, for two reasons. The first, of course, as James reminded us in his characteristically brilliant contribution, was that where are you going to build them? Sort of think of families growing up in the same corners of a town or a city, or even in John's case, the countryside. Then you say, well, we're selling off the council housing and we will build new homes. There are two problems with that. Number one, they didn't, and in fact, in many cases, they weren't allowed to for a significant part of this pertinent period. And reason number two, where? Well, your children want to live relatively near to you, but we're going to build some new homes on the other side of town or somewhere. Do you see? And then the bit I'd never actually thought about before I read it today in John Harris's rather good, the comment pages of The Guardian are becoming the yin to the Daily Telegraph's yang. So Daily Telegraph's comment pages are about as bonkers as it's possible for comment pages to be. And The Guardian, which is not a paper I have turned to first throughout the 20 years I've been writing this program, but it's got some brilliant opinion writers. It's got some really, really good, thoughtful opinion writers. And until I read John Harris this morning, I hadn't clocked that the requirement to enshrine right to buy in new social housing opens up the possibility of councils making a loss on places that they build now when they are compelled by legislation to sell them under the right to buy scheme. So far, it looks like it has been a bit of a disaster for the country, and even a much less beneficial boost than widely believed to the people who took direct advantage of it. But I could be wrong, and there's plenty of room for you to tell me that I am. Julie is in Desborough. Julie, what would you like to say?
Hello. I was a council tenant in Corby for 21 years as a single mum, and no chance of getting out. And I was lucky. There were in the 1996, 1997, they released a scheme called the Tenants Incentive Scheme.
Right.
And because I'd been a tenant for 21 years, I got the full discount. And so I got £6,000, which at that time was an enormous amount, but it could only be used on solicitors' fees and on a deposit to buy a house elsewhere. Oh. So that meant I was releasing a council house to a council tenant, but I was able to, because of the money, to get and buy a house myself, which I did.
I'd never heard of that before. Was that a council initiative? That Corby Council, was it? Or
no, I think it was a government thing at the time. It was in 90. I actually moved about 97, and mine was with the second tranche of the money.
Okay.
So I cannot remember A, which government was in, or B, because at the time I was just too busy trying to live,
getting on with it, Julie.
Yes, because I was a teacher, a full-time teacher, and I had two daughters, one who then moved out.
Okay.
And that was brilliant because it meant that I am now 70, and I own, with my husband, we own our own bungalow.
This would be a left-wing scheme, wouldn't it? This would be using public money as a sort of, forgive my indelicacy, Julie, but as a sort of laxative to get the pipes pumping and getting you out of somewhere into somewhere already in the private sector, and therefore freeing up a home in the public sector for somebody who wouldn't have been able to afford to move into the private sector in the way that you could. And no one, and the money stays.
I'm not sure.
And it stays with you. It stays with you. That asset. It doesn't get taken out of the public sector and put into the private.
No.
You get taken out of the public sector and put into the private sector, but the property doesn't.
Yeah, but it gives you that step up. Because in those days, it was easier to get a mortgage.
Every day's a school day, isn't it? I'm really having moments of, I've got pennies dropping all over the studio today. So the money that the government essentially wrote off, by saying, or ordered councils to write off by saying you can buy it at a massive discount. That money is real. It might only exist on paper, but you take that money, which you are prepared to write off, and instead you use it to subsidise people moving out of social housing into private housing, becoming homeowners.
Yeah.
And you don't lose the social housing at all.
No, it was a brilliant scheme.
Oh, well, it sounds. Someone will ring you now with spotting some flies in the ointment, I imagine, but it sounds pretty brilliant to me.
Well, the thing is, it was on a pro rata scheme. So if you'd been a council tenant for 4 years, you got so much, and you had to have completely paid your rent without arrears at all that time.
Of course.
And so it was a good incentive, apart from anything else, to encourage people to make sure they pay their rent. And later on, I became a Corby Borough councillor, and the right to buy scheme, then we were allowed to use the right to buy money then, later on, this would be about 4 years ago, to build new homes. And Corby was one of the only borough councils, it no longer exists because it's been taken over, but it was the only one that was actually using the right to buy money to build council houses. Because there's a time frame, you had to spend it it was a very tight time frame, so their forward plans, included all that.
Well, I have learned a lot from you today, including the existence of a scheme I wasn't previously aware of. And nobody's perfect, Julie. I probably should apologise for not being a bit better informed on this. Certainly some of my regular listeners are a little bit disappointed that I'm not. Felicity writes, finally, James, the penny has dropped. I was a councillor in Tower Hamlets when the right to buy scheme came in, and I could have told you the day after that it was going to be a disaster. We weren't even allowed to use the proceeds and could only use the interest to do repairs on existing stock. The domino effect was inevitable. I'm not sort of getting out the world's tiniest violin on this one, but I think one of the reasons why I wouldn't have had the confidence to dig into it as a net negative is, I think there are two reasons. I think the first is that the narrative has always been, even from people on the left, that this was a good policy because it helped people get on the property ladder. And if it hasn't worked out perfectly, it's not because of the principle behind the scheme, but it's the practicalities of its implementation. I'm far from alone in that. But also, I think that, a little bit of reverse snobbery or whatever you want to call it, like thinking, mate, you can't sit there as a homeowner denigrating a scheme or a policy designed to let people who would never be homeowners. So I think that's probably why my understanding of it has been exposed today as pretty poor. Thank you, Julie. Simon's in Launceston. Simon, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Pleasure, really. It's just that I was what we used to call a shared ownership scheme back in the late 80s, and there was indeed a television programme on BBC called Cream Teas and Concrete about it.
Oh, yeah.
And I'd like to say I think a lot of these so-called discount prices are fictitious. They're made up. There's cahoots between the local developers and the council. And just to give you some mathematics behind mine,
maybe on shared ownerships, but not on right to buy. The percentages are pretty clear here. That you got a massive discount, a maximum discount in 2014. It reached 70%.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we found ourselves in a position of the local. Again, I think the whole theme here is councils trying to do what's good for the council or the government in time, without looking at the long time forecast to help what's good for the whole country.
I suspect most councils wouldn't have wanted to do this, though, would they? But if it's national legislation, they have no choice. It's why it was interesting that James talked about councils dragging their feet and then new rules being introduced that compelled them to speed up. But I think your unhappy experience was not right to buy, was it? It was shared ownership.
It was a shared ownership. And the other thing I'd like to say, and
very briefly.
Why do you not think that the government took advantage of the time that the likes of Northern Rock were basically helped out by ourselves and the taxpayer, and at that time negotiated with the likes of those banks to say, look, we'll take you on, we'll bail you out. However, in the future, we need you to have a look at perhaps doing a subsidised mortgage.
It's a little bit of a give and take. You can answer that yourself. It's a rhetorical question, isn't it? But what was the phrase I used? Too big to fail. It would have been nice to see that. I think, hasn't Keir Starmer said something? No, that was more about energy than housing, wasn't it? But looking almost at a similar principle. Simon, thank you. I'm sorry to hurry you. It's 11:45.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 11:49, and as promised, this speech is going on forever, this Rishi Sunak speech, but the central thrust of it is that the country's in all sorts of peril, the country's facing all sorts of problems, and I, Rishi Sunak, am the man to fix things, which just sort of reminded me of the latest example of the curse of O'Brien, which I think I'm probably going to shelve it now. the desperation to find some members of the current Tory party who are not as obviously awful as sort of Nadine Dorries or Jacob Rees-Mogg or Suella Braverman or Honest Bob Jennery. I could go on. And it means that I have occasionally offered up some warm words about Tory ministers and then come very quickly to regret them. You, again, would probably find this hard to believe if you weren't there at the time, but I think, I know I spoke warmly about Matt Hancock at one point. I refuse to see this as a failing, by the way, the desire to see the best in people. If you allow that to be eroded away by the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, then what are you left with? Cynicism and performative cruelty. And there's far too much of that in this world. But it's inexcusably stupid to have not seen through Matt Hancock at the first opportunity. And similarly with James Cleverly. So I just think this example of how inappropriate James Cleverly's name is so powerful that it deserves a slightly wider audience. So on the 10th of May, which is what? Is that a Saturday? Yeah, on Saturday. It was Friday. It's very important you get the date right if you're criticising somebody else for being a bit slow on the uptake. So on Friday, James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, ladies and gentlemen, the actual Home Secretary, tweeted an article from many, many moons ago in which Yvette Cooper, the Shadow Home Secretary, urged the Conservative government to accept 10,000 refugees from, I think it was Syria. And James Cleverly tweeted on Friday, when Keir Starmer talks about illegal migration, this is who he wants to be, the Home Secretary. This is who he would put in charge of stopping the boats. A few days after this article was published, in which Yvette Cooper called the country immoral if it didn't take 10,000 refugees. A few days after this article was published, this is in September of 2015, this is actually extraordinary. You know, I've written a lot about this in the new book, Kept Off the Top Spot by Ultra Processed Food by Chris Van Tulleken, but I'm not remotely bitter. I've written a lot about the fact that there's been so much awfulness recently that things that would have stuck out like sore thumbs 10 years ago now don't stick out at all. But this is a public intervention from the actual Home Secretary attacking the Shadow Home Secretary for something that she said almost 10 years ago about the necessity of taking 10,000 refugees from Syria. It's 10,000 Syrian refugees. Guess what happened a few days after Yvette Cooper said we should take at least 10,000 Syrian refugees. It's immoral not to. Have a guess what happened a few days later. David Cameron, the Prime Minister, announced that the United Kingdom would be taking 20,000 refugees. And a Conservative MP called James Cleverly welcomed it. So that's how bent they are now. Also, it's still up. I mean, like most things the government put up at the moment, it's been community noted by Twitter. So the actual Home Secretary says, when Keir Starmer talks about illegal migration, this is who he wants to be, the Home Secretary. This is who he would put in charge of stopping the boats. And it references an article from 2015 that says, Yvette Cooper urges immoral UK to take 10,000 refugees. Days after that article appeared, the party of government, in which James Cleverly sat in the House of Commons, announces it's actually going to take 20,000 refugees, and James Cleverly greeted it with approval. Fast forward 9 years, he's either forgotten that or is so bent that he's pretending not to know it. What's worse, being stupid enough not to realise or being corrupt enough to lie? And that is your modern Conservative Party. Bent or stupid? Not, of course, to the exclusion of the possibility that it's both. Almost feels like it needed a jingle, that. Such an egregious example of political malfeasance does it represent. But I digress. The point is, Rishi Sunak is giving a speech at the moment saying, hey, the world's about to get really scary, but I'm the man to steer us through it. And Rishi Sunak made James Cleverly Home Secretary. He also made Suella Braverman Home Secretary, of course. So that's the man. Judging by his decisions, judging by his judgment. Suella Braverman in the Home Office, 30p lead Deputy Chairman of the party, and James Cleverly, who has, I think, soiled himself on a scale I've never seen a holder of one of the great high offices do before Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, and doing it all in public. Will you read that anywhere? No, because they will be too busy pretending that Angela Rayner's £1,500 alleged profit on a council house she bought nearly 20 years ago is somehow significant news. Goodness me. Back to Right to Buy via Angela Rayner, appropriately enough. Ian's in Amersham. Ian, what would you like to say?
Hi there, James.
Hello,
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It's not so much about the Right to Buy current situation. It's more what's happened since they did the old system. I have 3 children. I live in the Chilterns, beautiful part of the world, but incredibly expensive.
Is it?
Yeah. And reason why I'm calling is because I've got a daughter. Well, they were cut twins, and my daughter was disabled, born with cerebral palsy, which is obviously not very nice, but she can't even put her socks on. Now, we've done the right thing, me and my wife. My wife is a full-time carer. Yes. I have a decent job. I'm just hard-working, not the most intelligent person, but I've got to a decent salary. We've managed to save some money, but there is no council house that we could even think about getting in our area. We would need a bungalow, which could need to be adapted. So I look at the private property to buy. I'm looking at £600,000 to £700,000 in my area, minimum.
Good Lord!
It's an old council house. It needs probably about 50 to 60,000 plus spent on it. Now, I'm not looking for anybody to give us anything. We've never got anything, but I'm obviously concerned about my daughter.
No, but you should get something, mate. We pay our taxes, so that
means tested, pal. So we have savings. This isn't a phone up, Santa cry situation.
No, I hear
but
you.
even if we were lucky enough to put a few £100,000 down, now I know people don't have that type of money, but like I said, we've been lucky, blah blah blah. But we can't live in this area.
The stock has gone. There is no stock there for you and your family.
No, not at all. I don't think there's one. Now I look to rent, and a minimum. Again, bungalows are quite rare, but £3,000 a month.
What are you going to do?
Well, the reason why I've called up is actually I'm a neighbour of one of the previous callers. I'm in the same situation as he is. I own a park home. I bought it years ago, and we're debt-free, mortgage-free, hence why we were able to save.
Oh, I see.
But we didn't have twins at the time. We only had one child. So now we have 3. There's 5 of us. Just not big enough.
Living in a static... In a
correct. Yes.
And you live next door to John?
Correct. Yes.
I can't do an entire radio show on people living in the same plot on the same. I mean, it could be worth a try. But
just inspired by John. No, I've listened to your show a long time, but this housing needs to be talked.
I hadn't thought. But you're so right.
And
that's exactly the way to talk about it. To simply say that they've taken away, in a sense, that's a safety net. That's a safety net for a family that, as you've just described yourself, has abided by all the rules, played the game, and then I'm not describing your daughter by any stretch of the imagination as a misfortune, but I will, I think, with your permission, describe her condition as being unfortunate, and that's when the safety net should be in place to catch you. A society should catch people in that kind of situation, and social housing is one of the biggest stitches traditionally in that safety net, but it's gone completely, Ian, is what you're telling me.
There is not one. Like, the bottom line is she can't put her socks on now. She won't ever be able to put her socks on potentially, and obviously we've got a great family around her, but worried for their futures, my children, how they could possibly live in the south. Now, I'm from South Wales.
Yes.
Now, the option of moving back to Wales. But it's not cheap there either.
No, the money will go a little bit further, but the wages might suffer accordingly. Would you allow me to tell you something?
Correct. Yeah, correct on.
I don't speak for anyone except myself. I can't speak for anyone listening to this, but you sound like a really, really lovely man and a brilliant dad. You really do.
Well, it's very kind of you. I wouldn't say that much.
No,
but,
I know you wouldn't, because
you're
you personally, Ian. I know you keep talking up other people and you keep talking yourself down. You sound like a really lovely man, mate. And I'm sorry that you're going through this, but I am confident that you are possessed of the kind of attributes you need to make the best of the tough situation that you found yourself in. Just take the compliment.
That's appreciated, James, and I love your show. We listen to it every day. And
no, you don't have to. I just think sometimes we need to be a bit more forthcoming about what we hear and what we see. And you just something about the tone of your voice, the words that you use, the self-deprecation, and the obvious commitment to your family, something about that all together at the same time just moved me a bit, and I'm grateful to you for giving us a window into that experience, and I hope the family, you know. It's coming up to 12 noon. It's just gone 12 noon. In fact, you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Some fascinating developments in the High Court where the names of national newspaper editors who have been cited in some of the legal actions currently being brought by Prince Harry and others move into the public domain today. Would you be interested in knowing who they are? And indeed other journalists?
James O'Brien on LBC.
4 minutes after 12 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The increasingly sort of Kafkaesque nature of and I don't use that word lightly. What I mean by that is I'm not in any way trivialising the death, the bloodshed, the continuing carnage in Gaza, but the relationship between reality and reportage I don't think has ever been more strained, and it reaches into almost every corner of the conversation, doesn't it? Because the American government essentially warned Netanyahu of consequences in the event of a major offensive being undertaken against the city of Rafah, and there is now an offensive being undertaken against the city of Rafah, which the Israelis will simply claim was not a major offensive, and Joe Biden will be left to dance on a pinhead, and either conclude with quite a lot of evidence that it is, and therefore enact the consequences that he has been threatening, or he will accept this this profoundly disingenuous invitation from Benjamin Netanyahu to pretend that it's not a major offensive, even as tanks this morning were moving into Jabalia in the northern Gaza Strip, tanks and troops crossing a key highway on the outskirts of Rafah in the south, tanks trying to advance towards the heart of that camp, which is the biggest of Gaza's 8 historic refugee camps. Some of these people have already moved 3-4 times. Residents have said, this is Reuters reporting, that tank shells were landing at the centre of the camp. Airstrikes had destroyed clusters of houses. Hundreds of thousands of people told to move without having any clear idea of where they are supposed to move to. Egypt, interestingly, is elected over the weekend to join South Africa in the prosecution of those war crime allegations at the International Criminal Court. That won't obviously affect the court, but it changes the metrics of the entire process. And attention begins to turn. Oh, and meanwhile, thousands of Israelis took to the streets over the weekend calling for a deal to bring home hostages still held in Gaza by Hamas, and also for early elections and the immediate resignation of Benjamin Netanyahu. Opinion polls, interestingly enough, show that the public opinion simply doesn't wear the idea that the so-called eradication of Hamas is going to be possible, and yet that remains what Benjamin Netanyahu is committed to. In many ways, it's all he's got left. I don't think anybody really sets much store by the idea that he's committed to the rescuing or the return of the hostages. We know that he said, despite some very senior spokespeople apparently not having heard him say this, that even if hostages were returned, he would still go into Rafah. We're now dancing on that pinhead of what constitutes a major offensive and what doesn't. It's absolutely crazy. But attention now moves to this question. I mean, in a way, what do you think he thinks the end is going to look like is the question that I'm edging you towards. But that is quite nebulous, isn't it? So I need to work a little bit harder to zone in on what this actual inquiry is. But the Americans are now warning that extremists will return to fill any power vacuum left in Gaza. In fact, they've warned specifically that any power vacuum in Gaza would be filled by Hamas again, amid a resurgence of fighting between the terror group and the IDF. Places that they had claimed they had, from which they had eradicated Hamas, they are now going back to revivify conflict. So that first suspicion we had on this program ages and ages ago, that this was an unachievable goal, I think gathers weight every day. The other word I saw was anarchy. There will be anarchy. So you're going to have either extremism or anarchy moving into the vacuum created by these continuing attacks. And the Times of Israel reporting that the leader of Hamas isn't even in Rafah anymore, having fled to the tunnels around Khan Yunis before the IDF closed in. So again, the likelihood of so-called eradication moves ever further out of reach. And of course, the fate of the 132 remaining hostages looks, I would say, more and more precarious. But if Netanyahu, I mean, this is the bit, this is where we're going to confine our conversation, or rather it's where we're going to direct our conversation now, is not for you or for me, but for Benjamin Netanyahu. What does the end look like? Now, there are people in Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet who want to colonise Gaza. I hope that doesn't come as a shock to anybody. It's not an opinion, it's simply counting. There are people in Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet who are committed to what they call Greater Israel, which would also pose fairly hefty problems for the Kingdom of Jordan, never mind the international community. But Netanyahu has never been a subscriber to that school of thought. He's publicly and passionately opposed to a two-state solution. That sometimes gets lost in the rhetoric and conversation. And of course, there were as long ago as January, there were talks of sort of relocating Palestinians to elsewhere in the world. So we can't rule out that sort of thinking. But I don't personally believe it's Netanyahu's thinking. I think we've learnt in recent months that he's sufficiently opportunistic to contemplate almost anything if he thinks it'll keep him in power and out of court in the short term. But it's not a position he has held previously. Okay, he can't believe that eradicating Hamas and securing the release of the hostages are simultaneously possible. You can do one or you can do the other. I don't think you can do one, at least, but you can't do both. Some very senior Israeli, I think there was a former prime minister making that point publicly last week. You can't do both, not least because the likelihood of some of the remaining hostages being in the firing line of the ordnance currently dropping on a refugee camp in Rafah is high. You know, what possible discrimination do the IDF display when bombing Gaza that would suggest they're trying to keep hostages alive? Do you see what I mean? We don't know how many have died, but somewhat unhelpfully for people trying to maintain objectivity throughout these conversations, there will be hostages who have been killed by Israeli ordnance, not just the three who were shot dead by the IDF while waving white flags, or no, they'd taken off their shirts to prove that they were safe. They were hostages who'd managed somehow to evade their captors, and they got shot dead by Israeli soldiers. Again, something that is known, but perhaps not as widely reported as it should be. But the conversation, for good or for ill, has moved to the next phase, even if the military engagement hasn't. The protests on the street of Israel are about getting rid of Netanyahu and getting the hostages back. There seems to be an acceptance there that the eradication of Hamas is unachievable. But alongside that sits the news from America that there will be a power vacuum and it will be filled by Hamas, or the next iteration of whatever anti-Israel extremism looks like. So what does Netanyahu expect to happen? And I haven't got an answer to that question. And part of the reason why I haven't got an answer to that question is because I haven't been interested in the end game. I've been too heartbroken by the reality and continue to be. I don't know if you saw Gary Lineker's comments at the weekend about crying. And I had another penny drop moment. The blooming heck. That we live in a country where empathy is discouraged. The ruling class in this country has empathy, emotional literacy beaten out of it, literally, when I was at school. So, creating people that could march to the other side of the world under the auspices of empire and not just start bossing around the people who'd lived there forever, but also start nicking all their natural resources and sending them back to Britain. You have to create a very peculiar sort of person to undertake that sort of project. And that person can't really be unduly burdened by empathy or sympathy or emotional literacy. And it filters down. Our whole society in many ways is defined by the necessity of having men in our ruling class who can go all around the world and boss everybody else around. And so that means when people show emotion, when people show empathy, they get attacked by people who aren't capable of it or who are frightened of it. And the idea that it's controversial to talk about crying at the sight of dead children is one of the ugliest marks of how mad this whole saga has been and has become. Because the only thing you can say with certainty is that the death toll will grow. The 1,200 who died on October the 7th when Hamas invaded Israel or mounted an incursion into Israel, 250 taken hostage, of whom about half remain, some released, some known to be dead, and then the as yet unconfirmed figures, much higher figures of Palestinian dead, well over 30,000, it would appear, and probably much higher once the dust has settled. So I think today's the day, for the first time, that we're going to ask, what's it going to look like afterward? What's it going to look like when it's over? And you can come at that from whatever angle you want, can't you? Because I don't know. All I know is that as a consumer of news, I am now hearing warnings of anarchy, power vacuums, and extremism. We've thought from the start that the Israeli tactics, that Netanyahu's tactics will create generations, possibly even more dedicated to the destruction of Israel than previous ones. How do you process the deaths of your entire family, the dislocations, the dispossessions, without holding Israel responsible? So that's part of the question that I'm asking. But if you look at the question of how Benjamin Netanyahu thinks this is going to end, and you can't answer that question, you should be quite frightened, I think, don't you? So there are two ways into this. Number one, 0345 6060 973. Jamie says, you've dropped so many pennies today, James, you must have £1 by now. It's not far off, Jamie. But question number one is, how do you think this is going to end? Especially if you know this part of the world better than I do. What's it going to look like? How does this end? First time in my life I just understood why George Orwell writes about perpetual war in 1984. Never fully got that before that moment, right there. But I think it has to end in terms of the current engagement. So how does it end? What does it look like? What does Gaza look like when this is over? What does Israel look like when this is over? 0345 6060 973. Okay? And then the second question. What is the end game that Benjamin Netanyahu has in his mind? So it's a combination of what do you think he thinks and what do you think he wants? So what is the end game that Benjamin Netanyahu has in his mind as he flirts with a direct rejection of American calls for caution? Well, you could say flirt. He may already have consummated that. So how does it end, in your opinion? And what do you think his idea of the end game is? 0345 6060 973. Hit the numbers now, you will get through.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 20 minutes after 12, and that word anarchy is in another report as well. Fierce fighting rocks Gaza after US warning of post-war anarchy. So you have Antony Blinken talking of extremism moving into a vacuum, or essentially Hamas benefiting from the vacuum that may be left in Gaza. And then you have fears being expressed that the situation there will be anarchy. 360,000 people have fled Rafah already. That's from the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA. They've also warned that no place is safe in the largely devastated territory. And it's Antony Blinken saying yesterday that Washington has not seen any credible Israeli plan to protect civilians in Rafah, and that we also haven't seen a plan for what happens the day after this war in Gaza ends. There it is. That's precisely the sentence that informs my question to you. We haven't seen a plan for what happens the day after this war in Gaza ends. What will Gaza look like the day after this war in Gaza ends? Leon is in Enfield. Leon, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thanks for taking my call.
Very welcome.
I'm just calling in about your question about Netanyahu's strategy and or the IDF-Israel strategy with this, and with regards to, for example, now you say that they are reoperating in Jabalia in the north of Gaza, because areas that they have previously defeated the Hamas battalions there, the IDF has withdrawn, and then Hamas has refilled the gap, and so now the IDF is going in and fighting them again in those areas, and I think that's the strategy. I actually heard an interview with Netanyahu yesterday, and he was talking a little bit about this and how the process is to defeat Hamas. It's never going to be like a kill every single fighter or kill every everyone within the organization or the terrorist army, but there are going to be operations.
Well, what does eradicate mean then?
No, I'm saying that's why I just said he won't eradicate.
But that's Hamas. The language he uses.
Yes, I mean he has done, but I think more recently he has said that, or Israel in general have said that the idea is to defeat them militarily, to prevent them.
So they won't have been eradicated, and then one day it ends.
No, but the force itself will be eradicated as a force, or as the ability to. How? Okay, so the other strategy, part of the strategy, is you're talking about Rafah. The area in Rafah is along the border with Egypt, right? There's the Philadelphia corridor. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that term. It's that borderline across with Egypt and Gaza. That's where a lot of the weapons over the years, the resupply lines have been smuggled under the tunnels there.
I don't know how many calls I'm going to be able to take on this. So I don't want to use up too much time with extraneous information. Israel's on the trajectory, potentially, to inherit an insurgency with many armed Hamas left, or if it leaves a vacuum filled by chaos, filled by anarchy, and probably refilled by Hamas. That's Secretary of State, the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. That's the focus of our conversation today.
Okay, fine.
That was pretty clear from the start. What do you think, having heard this interview with him yesterday, what do you think Netanyahu's idea of an end game is? And with respect, the answer to that question is not, he's just going to carry on fighting.
No, it's not carrying on.
So speak directly to the... hang on. Speak directly to the warning from the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, of an insurgency with many armed Hamas left, or a vacuum filled by chaos, filled by anarchy, and probably refilled by Hamas. Because that looks pretty inevitable to me.
Okay, right. So in terms of regular targeting of Hamas resurgence, that needs to be done. The fact is, for the day after, when Hamas is more defeated...
No, but Antony Blinken is saying it won't be, isn't he? He's saying that they will still be there. I don't know if we're at cross purposes.
Like no. Let's put it like this, right? No one will come in to rule the Gaza Strip while Hamas is still a fighting force.
That's what a vacuum. That's a vacuum then.
Yes, okay, yes. But you have to get to the point where Hamas is.
And Blinken is warning that the vacuum will be filled by anarchy and extremism, and probably Hamas. So you're subscribing to the idea that Hamas can somehow be hobbled, and that is the only thing that's still sustaining the killings in Gaza. I guess you have to believe that, don't you? Because the alternative is to face reality.
Okay, let's put it like this. What do the Americans do in Afghanistan?
No, you're doing it again, you see. We're zoning in on a really pertinent and interesting question. I'm not interested in what the Americans did in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is currently under the rule of the Taliban, Leon. I don't know if you're aware of that. So the question is about what Gaza is going to look like when this is over. And you've been on for, I think, 8 minutes. You haven't tried to answer it yet.
For 8 minutes. But my point is that...
What's Gaza going to look like when it's over?
When it's over, it needs to be ruled by local Palestinian people.
Yeah, and the Secretary of State of America is saying that is not going to happen. But as I said a moment ago, you have to sort of cling to the idea that it will. I suppose if you're supportive of the continuing carnage in Gaza, you have to sort of cling to the idea that there's a logic to the illogical, even as the American Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, points out that what is likely or close to certain to be there is an insurgency with many armed Hamas left, or if it leaves a vacuum filled by chaos, it will be filled by anarchy and then probably refilled by Hamas. I think this has been obvious from the start, but I suppose if I wanted to continue to support what's happening today in Rafah, then I'd have to conjure up some sort of alternative reality in which a government in waiting will step up to the plate in the Gaza Strip without having any animosity or negativity built upon the experiences of the last 6 months. Fingers crossed. Colin's in Market Waiting. Colin, what would you like to say?
Hey, good afternoon, is it now? Yeah, what I would like to say, James, is that this is an absolute disaster, and what we look forward to is the wreckage of that disaster. I say this as a Jewish person of great humbleness and as a humanity.
You can't describe yourself as hugely humble, Colin. You have to let other people do that, right, surely.
Well, I say it with humility. It's
yes,
rubbish language.
Of course.
It's the pressures of being on the radio.
I know. I'm teasing you.
Yes, all right. I like a bit of teasing. What I'm trying to say is that there is devastation. There is a husk of societies, two societies hollowed out by Hamas and the Netanyahu government. After it is all over, Gaza is going to be a complete and utter mess and a disaster, full of people who are so bruised, so hurt, so full of the anger of what's going to happen in the future. And the same in Israel too. The Netanyahu government Netanyahu is just really all about, in my opinion, just trying to keep in power and being enthralled to some really dangerous lunatic.
But what does it look like when it ends?
It looks a mess. It looks like a mess.
Yeah.
It looks like
and what do you
Israel
think
is going to be in chaos for a long time.
And what do you think Netanyahu thinks the end looks like? Because if we take the last caller's suggestion that there might be a new Palestinian leadership, that would have to be dedicated to a two-state solution. So that would be Netanyahu's worst nightmare.
Netanyahu, in my opinion, isn't capable of thinking about the future. Right. He's only thinking about gripping to the sides of his power. He hasn't got the imagination. He's a narcissist and an opportunist, and those types of people don't think ahead. They're not a question of any plan, vision, strategy, or anything like that. It's just hang on for the best and hope you don't get locked up, which is what you're hoping for.
Has that been clear to you from the very start?
I think so, yeah. I remember my father telling me it was all going pear-shaped with Ariel Sharon when he walked into the Muslim area in Jerusalem. And there's been this sort of desire to court, and it's affecting the whole of the world, and this is probably the worst example at the moment, or you could add in Russia as well, of course, where these people just are interested in themselves. What is the point of being a president or a prime minister if you're not bettering your country, if you're not bettering your world? What is the point of just being there for grandiosity?
I mean, Netanyahu has an answer to that, and he gave it in a speech in the last day or two, because he talks about the war of independence not being over. Our war of independence is not over yet. It continues even today, because it's Memorial Day in Israel, as I'm sure you know. We are determined to win this struggle, and I suppose in a way we're asking what winning actually looks like. Thank you, Colin. It's 12:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where Amelia Cox has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:34. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I noticed that I failed to credit the New Economics Foundation with the research and statistics that I cited in our conversation about Right to Buy scheme. How do I know that I failed to do it? Because the head of social policy, Tom Pollard, at the New Economics Foundation, has just tweeted a little clip of me talking about it and kindly not pointed out that I failed to provide my sources for it. I did mention John Harris's article in The Guardian, but you should have a look at their work as well. I'll retweet that now so that you can have a look at the broader report, which you can read in full there. So poor show, O'Brien. Do better. Back to this question, really. Netanyahu giving a speech about winning. We are determined to win this struggle. What does the battlefield look like then when it's over? The phrase car park has appeared 3 times in my inbox as a consequence of that, without any frivolity whatsoever. But of course, that doesn't address the humans that will still be in that space. So what do you think it's going to look like? What do you think he thinks it's going to look like? Claire's in Wimbledon. Claire, what would you like to say?
Well, first of all, to put it in the picture, the Israelis say all the time that they have to destroy Hamas because their wish is to destroy Israel and kill all the Israelis. Yes. I think that goes both ways. If you listen to some of Netanyahu's ministers, we've had nuke them, set them on fire. Another one of them said, let's get them all adopted by different countries. So I think, in many ways, it's pot calling the kettle black. And sadly, with what's going on, nobody wants to put feet on the ground from outside because of what it might cause. And I think the likely solution is it will eventually simmer down once they've killed enough of Hamas. And Israel won't want to take the IDF out, so that they'll police the Gazans.
So it turns into another West Bank, really.
Yeah, exactly.
But with settlers. With settlers.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lady you may have seen on TV. I'm sorry, I can't remember her name,
That's all right.
She's busy taking bookings for front sea plots. Have you seen her?
No, I haven't. I don't. I'm always slightly wary of.
She often talks when challenged and says that it's God gave us this land.
Okay.
And she's.
So this is the rhetoric, the ideology of Greater Israel, which you're right, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir subscribe to. And I've heard a lot of people tell me, and I think I may have been a bit too accommodating with them, Claire, that, you can't take them as evidence of what Netanyahu wants to do. But they've essentially got Netanyahu by the short and curlies, haven't they? Because without their support...
I'm not sure he doesn't want to do that. I mean, I'm sorry, anybody who says, keeps on giving us the rhetoric that they're doing their best not to hurt civilians, and yet, once again, have cut off all the food and the water, sending people to places where there is no water and no food, etc., and against the entire world continuing to bomb these people who have no guns. I mean, everybody says, I'm sick of hearing they have a right to self-defense. This isn't a normal situation. If it was another country, they'd go over the border, they'd be... these people are locked in a cage. They can't go anywhere. They can't escape. And only a few people in Gaza, Hamas, have guns to fight with against a force that is enormous. And so there's an obscenity in that to start with. But, every indication within the first few days were that they didn't give stuff.
Well, when we were splitting hairs about proportionality and suitable or robust response.
If I hear the word "we're concerned" one more time, I'm going to explode.
Well, don't explode, Claire. That would be infelicitous for all concerned. So what has happened over the months is that the early fears and warnings of people who hold Benjamin Netanyahu in very low regard have been serially confirmed, haven't they? The idea that a proportionate response existed is probably one for the history books, but that ship sailed a long time ago. And then you have the warnings from allies. You have the unprecedented, well, to my mind, unprecedented interventions from people like Chuck Schumer, the use of the word pariah, the slow sense of Israel detaching itself through either the sort of imperial ambitions that you've alluded to, or the naked self-interest of Benjamin Netanyahu, or a little bit of both. A sense that Israel, under Netanyahu, has detached itself from traditional allies, up to and including the United States of America, and geographically, you know, there are peace treaties in place, but Egypt now joining South Africa in the prosecution of those war crime allegations. So you see Gaza.
They don't care what's happening. I mean, the international court has already told them, certain things, and it couldn't care less. Couldn't care less. And I think if they get to a stage where everything's sort of under control, and they've got the population sort of under control, it will fade out of the news, and much like the West Bank,
like the West Bank has
sat there. People have sat there for years ignoring the fact because there was not too much going on apart from more and more land being taken, and that wasn't causing a war. It wasn't causing a war. So the eyes of the world went away after the 70-something treaty, where.
And the BBC that was a programme last week about, because for people who don't understand the difference between the military and the sort of military police, so the rules are very different in the West Bank compared to Gaza, which is why a BBC documentary last week was so powerful, suggesting providing quite a lot of evidence for the allegation that a war crime had been committed when an 8-year-old boy was shot dead. Claire, thank you. There's not, I think, a slightly inappropriate way of phrasing it, but the idea of a more positive end game, very short on the ground. There is a sense that some people supportive of Benjamin Netanyahu stopped caring, if they ever did, about how many Palestinians will die, and cling to the notion that it's somehow justified by the eradication of Hamas or the need to release the hostages. I think that is the milestone that will never be reached. For them, I think, for people a little bit more objective, you could at some point have argued that, certainly one or the other, the eradication, the military defeat of Hamas, I think is feasible. Bernie Sanders talked about that this weekend. The eradication of Hamas is impossible, but the military defeat of Hamas is probably feasible. But, as the case of the British-Israeli hostage, Nadav Popplewell demonstrated this weekend, you can't do both, because you will kill the hostages while pursuing Hamas. And it was Hamas who said on Saturday that Nadav had died in an Israeli airstrike a month ago. They haven't yet provided any evidence, and the Israeli military has not offered any comment. But what happens next? Bill's in Dorking. Bill, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello,
we got. You're exactly right. We all know exactly how it's going to end.
I don't know
We've just got too much humanity in us to admit it. There is not going to be a seagull left alive there. They're just going to obliterate the whole place. Just everything, moving back and forth until there is absolute devastation everywhere.
Well, I don't think that's true. I'm certainly not saying it for reasons of delicacy or humanity. I can't conceive of 2 million people being killed, and I don't think you can either. Can you?
In bits and drabs, yeah.
Well, over what sort of... Well, then it never ends.
Exactly. Over the next year, they just, or however long it takes, they do manage to kill them all off. And it'll be everybody be dead. Everything, everybody. Sorry.
No, well, you don't have to apologise, and I know your laughter is more nervous than callous, but I don't agree. I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? Whatever figure you accept as the current death toll, the point at which America says enough is enough has to be considerably south of 2 million. I mean, it just does, and America, I think, has that power, has that agency. They said, Aura is in Oxfordshire. Why don't you preach to protest to dismantle Hamas? Then there wouldn't be the need to fight in Rafah or for Israel to stay in Gaza, and Israel will be safe and the world will be a safer place. I presume you tuned in a bit late, Aura. The entire conversation is built upon the fears expressed by the American Secretary of State Antony Blinken of what will be left in the event of Hamas being dismantled. And they talk of anarchy and a vacuum into which Hamas 2.0 would quickly move. I think that's the bit I never got. The bit I never got was the idea that you could defeat the animus. You know, you might be able to kill everybody who says that they are a member of Hamas, or everybody who can be proved to be a member of Hamas. I don't think you can, but it is at least, it's an intellectually feasible proposition, isn't it? But what is going to be left in the hearts and minds of orphans? What is going to be left in the hearts and minds of the dispossessed, of the homeless, of the grieving brothers and sisters? I never got that. We talked about this, I think, before the end of October of last year. What does that mean to eradicate Hamas when you are almost certainly, surely everyone would agree that even as you seek to defeat Hamas militarily and seem supremely comfortable with epic levels of civilian loss, you can't eradicate the hatred that you are currently engendering by doing what you're doing today in Rafah. That's the bit I never got. I've never unravelled that. I'm not sure I've ever tried. Perhaps I should have done.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:48. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Now, I know I did a hook and tease on it, but I think I'm going to have to postpone it until tomorrow, the latest court papers in the Prince Harry case against the Daily Mail. And, of course, Daily Mail continue to deny all knowledge. 4 current national newspaper editors named in the unlawful news-gathering claims. I suppose I should tell you now, shouldn't I? Or shall I tell you tomorrow? We'll decide shortly, because Natasha Clark is here, LBC's political editor, who was at the PM's speech today. Can I start? Because I don't know what angle you're going to take. But Sunak's done something that, from where I'm sitting, appears to be quite spectacularly stupid. When he has talked about Keir Starmer having gone from embracing embracing Jeremy Corbyn to embracing Natalie Elphicke. Keir Starmer has been dedicated since 2019 to showing voters that he has changed his party beyond all recognition. And Rishi Sunak is doing his PR in that sentence, in that phrase there.
Yeah, it was very interesting listening to him try and say that Natalie Elphicke's defection shows that Keir Starmer doesn't have any principles. But exactly like you say, the whole point of Keir Starmer's premiership and what many people genuinely thought that was going to be impossible, that the idea that Labour could win the next election, is that he's been trying to take his party on a journey and then show that, like I say, that voters can trust the Labour Party. Again. But look, yes, the speech was generally about trying to set up the party, the country, for what will be, what he hopes, the general election fight to come. And obviously he's not actually called the date yet, but that was the election calling speech, I thought, with everything but the date in it. He's just fired the whole starting gun on what the narrative that he wants to paint. And his overarching message in that was security. So he's telling us he is the man to provide that economic security, the national security, and for our country's future. Some of very doomster and gloomster at first glance. And he's actually said, he spoke about how the world was getting as close to nuclear war as he thought it did during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
More will change in the next 5 years than in the last 30. I'm convinced that the next few years will be some of the most dangerous, yet the most transformational that our country has ever known. So the question we face today is this: who has the clear plan and bold ideas to deliver a secure future for you and your family? The dangers that threaten our country are real. They're increasing in number. An axis of authoritarian states like Russia, Iran, North Korea and China is working together to undermine us and our values. War has returned to Europe, with our NATO allies warning that if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, they might be next. War rages too in the Middle East, as Israel defends itself, not only against the terrorists of Hamas, but a barrage of missiles fired for the first time directly from Iran. Right now in Africa, conflicts are being fought in 18 different countries. And Putin's recklessness has taken us closer to a dangerous nuclear escalation than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
So what he was trying to do, I think, is provide a little bit more of what Rishi Sunakism is, what his vision is for the future.
Rishi Sunakism is?
What Rishi Sunakism is.
What is Sunakism? Sunakism is. Carry on.
He said that our country is at a crossroads, that he's trying to lay out the choices that the people will face come that next election. And I asked him, does this essentially mean that you're saying that Keir Starmer is a danger to our security?
At the end of the day, when it comes to this question, right, his track record would tell you that. And I don't say this for political point scoring, but that is just the reality of the situation. He's someone who believed Jeremy Corbyn would make a good Prime Minister of our country, not once but twice. Jeremy Corbyn wanted to pull us out of NATO, wanted to scrap the army. Multiple members of the government that Labour would provide don't believe in a nuclear deterrent. So I don't see how you can, with a straight face, say to the country, yes, I'm prepared to do what it takes to keep you safe. The evidence just doesn't suggest that at all. And actually, Labour Party and Keir Starmer not matching our investment on defence spending emboldens our adversaries. What do you think Putin thinks when he sees that? That he thinks the West isn't prepared to make the tough choices to invest in their security?
So that's Keir Starmer is apparently a danger to our security, which is a very interesting message to try and put across to the country, which I don't know if that's going to work.
Well, I read the 2019 manifesto, and I am far from a cheerleader for Jeremy Corbyn, but the commitment to remaining in NATO was pretty clear. So where's he got that from? Do we know?
I think whatever Jeremy Corbyn thought about NATO, whatever he thought about our economic security and our nuclear deterrent and things, those are fair points to make. But yes, it was not on the ballot box in 2019. At all. And finally, I just wanted to also play you a little clip from when he was talking about Liz Truss. And this is something we talked about at PMQs last week, how he's starting finally to distance himself from that Liz Truss premiership and trying to basically say that it's nothing to do with me.
But he did back her, didn't he?
He did. Sorry.
He did. Well, he kind of. Well, not didn't back her. He lost to her. But previously, he's been very reluctant to say.
He has been very reluctant to essentially put his hands up and say, put his hands up and say, Liz Truss actually, he said, let's not judge my record on the 49 days of Liz Truss's premiership.
When Labour ignores the achievements of the last 14 years, or try to reduce the last 14 years to 49 days, remember what they're actually doing is trying to distract you from the thing that matters most. The future. Now I'm clear-eyed enough to admit that yes, maybe they can depress their way to victory, with all their talk of doom loops and gaslighting and scaremongering about pensions. But I don't think it will work. Because at heart, we're a nation of optimists. We're not blind to the challenges or threats that we face. We just have an innate belief that whatever they are, we can overcome them, as we have done so many times in our history, and create a secure future for you and your family.
So the Prime Minister finally distancing himself from that chaotic reign of Liz Truss. And I think that's one of the things that Number 10 are considering when they're talking about when to decide to call that election date, is how far they can push it. Because the later you can push it, the more you can say, I'm nothing to do with Liz Truss. I've tried my best to turn things around. But will it work? I'm not sure.
Not if people are still paying mortgages. Does he know who's been in power for the last 15 years?
It doesn't feel like it, does it? It's Mr. Change candidate coming out again. Do you think someone should
tell him? Yeah. Could you tell him? Because I noticed that you were on his podium. There's a nice photograph of you on his podium.
It's a very old photo, that of me.
It's a very nice photograph of you.
How does that work?
How does that work? Because I like that
it's just in case the Prime Minister forgets,
to LBC.
He forgets what my face looks like. In case
but you were in 6th place.
That's not bad,
after The Sun, The Telegraph, ITV, the BBC and the Daily Mail. That's brilliant.
That's not bad.
Can we start moving up this chart, do you think? Can we get some? Because in the tradition of radio demands now that we start playing that old bit of music, doesn't it? The Fluff Freeman bit that goes with the hit parade. So at 7, it's Gary Gibbon of Channel 4. At 6,
I think I should be able to LB. No offence to Mr. Gibbon, I think I should be able to.
No, I want you to take down Mason.
Okay,
that's your mission.
Lovely.
I was before Mason the other day, actually.
Were you?
Yeah.
Well, you can take down Groves of the Mail, can't you?
I could try.
Fantastic.
He's got sharp elbows as Groves.
We should add that this speech was delivered not in the House of Commons or on what you could call neutral ground. It was delivered at the Policy Exchange think tank, which seems to have become Rishi Sunak's favourite think tank.
It has. He's long been a fan of Policy Exchange. What actually scared us all the most was when we looked at the podium, we just thought, is there any chance you can just rip off that big shiny crest and just call an election right here?
Part it on his...
The room was packed with aides and MPs and everyone. It really did feel like that was the speech that he was going to be look, he could have easily. He could have easily. Yeah, he
there
could
was
have
a chance
easily.
he was going to make a big announcement today.
I thought maybe that could be it.
Okay.
But
I would urge everyone to have a look at the latest reports by De Smog, which is an excellent investigative journalism website looking at environmental matters, revealing that Shell and BP were given, quotes, ample opportunity, end quotes, to privately influence a policy exchange report on carbon taxes, and they remain gloriously opaque about where their funding comes from. But while that gives me the shivers, it doesn't apparently have any impact whatsoever on Rishi Sunak's judgment on whether or not that is or is not a suitable place for the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to make announcements. Natasha, great stuff. Thank you very much. I've got a hook and tease to finish on. I promised that I would. It is an extraordinary story, this, which I will cover in a little bit more detail tomorrow. But by way of, remembering to kill the suspense that I started building up at 10 o'clock this morning, and B, this one really does get filed under stories that you're not really going to read much about in your newspapers for reasons that will become quickly obvious. 4 current editors of UK national newspapers, including the editor of the London Times, are among dozens of current and former journalists from the Mail newspapers alleged to have employed private investigators to gather information by unlawful means. This is in new court papers brought into the light by Prince Harry's case against the Daily Mail, which of course the Mail deny all wrongdoing, but it now means the names of 70 journalists have moved into the light, and those 4 editors are Tony Gallagher, Victoria Newton, Ben Taylor and David Dillon, respectively the editors of The Times, The Sun, The Sunday Times and The Mail on Sunday. Quite a lot of familiar names, actually, on these lists, which we will be exploring in rather more detail tomorrow. That's it from me for another day. We'll be doing it all again tomorrow morning from 10. If you missed any of today's show, you can, of course, listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, the official LBC app, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it's time for Sheila Fogarty.
Thanks very much, James.
James O'Brien on LBC.